Hey everybody, welcome to Module 6. In this module, we'll shift away from poetry writing and we'll begin our study of fiction writing. So this is kind of an exciting change, a breath of fresh air, something new. So I want you to take a piece of paper out and a pen, and I want you to answer a couple of questions before we get started. I want you to answer this question: what does story mean to you? Take a few minutes to jot down some ideas. And then while you're jotting those down, what are some examples of good stories? So go ahead and think about that for a couple minutes. Go ahead, pause the video if you need to. That's totally fine. And then come back. Okay, so hopefully you had a little bit of time to think about what the idea of story means to you. For me, the idea of story has a lot to do with just the artistic notion of shaping a sequence of events to have a certain effect on whoever the audience is. My idea of story has changed over the years based on my experiences. And I think just that word can really send us into a big, long discussion of stories and their effects. Now, what makes good stories? This is purely subjective. I will not give you choices you must agree with when I tell you what I think a good story is, and your choices are just as valid as mine. So we all have kind of a slightly different definition of what makes a good story. Now, three examples off the top of my head, um, stories that I like. One that always comes to mind is a piece of flash fiction by Amy Bender. You're going to read one this week, or if you haven't already read it, there is one in your text by Amy Bender that I really like. But there's another piece of flash fiction by her that I like even more called The Rememberer, in which the main character tells the story of her lover literally de-evolving in front of her very eyes. It's told um, very realistically and literally as if it is really happening. So, is it a metaphor? Is it meant to be literal? I don't know, but it's just so good. It was kind of my first experience, many years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, with this type of fiction where obviously what was happening in the story couldn't obviously be happening, but it was told in such a literary, um, straightforward way. And I just really loved that story. So if you're interested, I'm going to include the link below this video. Another example of a good story that I really like is the movie called The Curious Case of Benjamin Button. That one is, uh, I love what that story does because it has two characters on kind of opposite narrative arcs. One starts at the beginning of their life, the other one starts at the end of their life, and they move towards each other, and there's an intersection in the middle. They meet in the middle, and it's just amazingly beautiful and sad all at the same time. And so what I love about that story is just how the setup creates a situation where the writer has to figure out, now how would this work out? How would this happen if these two characters are set on these trajectories towards each other? So I really, it creates an amazing, beautiful effect in the story. So there's a lot there that I really love. Now, stories can also sit with us and be favorites, maybe not so much because of their quality, but because of what's happening in our lives around the same time as the story meets us there. And I think an example of that with me is, and don't be mad at me for this, but I have a teenage daughter who loves Taylor Swift, and of course, right? Um, and through her and her experience of listening to Taylor Swift, of course, I got introduced to the song All Too Well, the 10-minute version where she sings a story for 10 minutes. Like, who can even do that and keep your attention? Not most artists, but The experience of learning that song through the eyes of my daughter, and then the both of us being able to drive in the car and sing the whole 10 minutes from start to finish. It's just, for me, I don't know if it's effective storytelling. She's a very talented artist, but I think the whole experience of the story and my daughter and all of it together and the music, that makes, that's a great story for me in my life. Don't hate me. Don't leave the class because I said it. Or maybe you're a Taylor Swift fan and you love it. Either way. But that just shows you how subjective and how based in our own experience our perception of a story is. So that's why you can make a case for just about anything being a good story, as long as you make a good case, right? So, what makes them good? Relatable characters, emotional impact, surprising twists, memorable settings, either for the story itself or you when you're experiencing the story for the first time. What do you most enjoy in a story? Think about that a little bit. Do you enjoy authenticity, humor, depth? What makes you stop watching or stop reading? What will stop you from staying with a story? All of these are questions that we think about when we think about what makes good stories. Now, stories are everywhere, and you know this because you're here in the United States, and our whole culture, and it revolves around story in so many different ways. They are everywhere: movies, TV, online, advertisements, song lyrics, the news, and stories are shaped everywhere for different purposes. um, think about that a little bit. Expand your definition. What unexpected forms tell compelling stories? Where are some places where maybe you see compelling stories that are unexpected? Um, one place that I enjoy the stories every year is during the Super Bowl ads. Those are all little mini stories, and it's always fun to see what those advertisers are going to come up with. Another football related kind of compelling, but unexpectedly compelling place to find stories is when you start to learn the stories behind the players on teams, either at the NFL level or at the college level. I am part of a football family. I have a husband who played, and then a son who is currently playing in the college level. And and my oldest daughter loves football, so there's football talk all the time in our house. And it's funny because Mom, the creative writing professor, is mostly just interested in the stories of the players and the backstory behind everything. That's when I get interested. Less so the games, more so the stories behind the games. That's what I enjoy. My dog's going to make a cameo appearance. This is one of my two pups. This is the older one, Bo. I've got a brand new puppy that's almost 12 weeks old sitting at my feet right now, too. So sometimes they like to show up in my videos. Um, so, what is fiction? Fiction is something shaped or fashioned, made up, not quite 100% true, maybe 0% true, but somewhere between 0 and less than 100% true. We fictionalize even true stories by choosing what to include or what to leave out. And our imagination is key to fiction. We add to stories, we imagine, we make things up. That's fiction. Now, fiction versus other genres. Fiction uses prose as opposed to poetry, which uses charged rhythmic language. Fiction as opposed to plays or scripts. Plays and scripts are meant to be performed. They look different on the page, and they're structured differently. Still stories, but not necessarily fiction. Okay. Nonfiction claims to be true and is accountable to evidence. So that's what makes it differ from fiction. Fiction isn't accountable to evidence in the same way. One example of how nonfiction is accountable to evidence goes back to the story of James Fry. I don't know if some of you may be too young to remember this, but I know some of you are old enough to remember. This was kind of a big deal. James Fry wrote a memoir called A Million Little Pieces. It was super popular. Oprah Winfrey promoted it on her show in her book club. Recommended that we all read it. And it was a story of his battle with addiction. And it was very intense and raw, and people really liked it. And he got very popular and sold a lot of books. Unfortunately, it came to light that he had sold that book as a memoir, so people assumed it was basically true, not fiction. And it came to light that he had fictionalized a lot of it. And so there was a lot of controversy over it. Oprah invited him back on her show to answer for that, and there was a big public backlash. So there it's important to acknowledge when you're telling the truth and when you might not be telling the truth in its fullness. The topic of memoirs and creative nonfiction, we'll talk more about this in our next section after we study fiction, but that whole idea of what's really true and what's not, and how we shape even our true stories, it's an important conversation that's um, pretty prevalent in the creative writing world and in the world at large, right? We see people being questioned on their true stories all the time. Another example of a genre that maybe is just slightly different from fiction is historical fiction. So, historical fiction talks about past events and then they are fictionalized and told from a creative perspective. So, when you approach a piece of historical fiction, you know that that's different to a degree than regular fiction because it's based in true events, but it has been artistically rearranged in some way. Now, what about genre fiction? Genre fiction is a thing and literary fiction is a thing. Okay, there's a difference. Now, initially, when you hear fiction, you might be thinking of genre fiction, romance, fantasy, horror, thriller, sci-fi. These are a whole subset of fiction. These genres follow familiar conventions. They have certain types of characters. We go into them to enjoy a predictable outcome. They are comforting, they're formulaic, and we kind of know what's going to happen. That's what genre fiction is, okay? Um, Now, literary fiction differs from that. Literary fiction values originality, ambiguity, character over plot. It focuses on voice, style, and complexity. It lives in uncertainty and nuance. So, in this class, we aren't going to be spending time in genre fiction. That may disappoint some of you, but we're going to be spending our time in literary fiction. Okay, so that's the difference. Now, we don't have a lot of time together in this semester. So, the type of fiction that we're going to be writing is called short fiction or flash fiction. I'm going to be calling it flash fiction from now on. Now, flash fiction stories are just a few hundred words to less than 2,000. They kind of top out at 2,000 words. They're no longer than that. So they're technically not even really short stories the way that you would see short stories in a typical anthology. They're even shorter than that. That's why they're called flash fiction. They demand concise original storytelling and they don't fit into the formulas of genre work. So you're not going to see a romance flash fiction piece. It doesn't work. The conventions of a romance story don't fit into flash fiction. The conventions of sci-fi don't fit into flash fiction. Now, don't get confused because you can have elements of science fiction in your flash fiction story, but a lot of the time those genre bits need more explanation than you have room for. Okay? It's kind of a confusing idea. We'll play with it as we go. And if you feel yourself having questions about that, we can have more conversations via the inbox. You let me know if you need more specifics on that. But basically, we're going to be focusing on flash fiction, literary fiction, and these pieces will be relatively small. What happens here is this forces your hand on your creativity. You have to be creative and you have to be purposeful in a very short space. It's like painting a landscape on a grain of rice. Or the way I like to think of the definition of flash fiction is that the story is so quick and so sharp and so bright that it leaves a sear on your eyelids, kind of like when you look at something bright and then you close your eyes and the image of the bright thing is still there. I like that definition of flash fiction. It's over so fast, but yet it leaves this impression where you can still see it. Okay. Okay, so what are the core elements of flash fiction? First off, structure and design. Every word counts. There's no room for digression. There's no room for rabbit trails, basically. Character. Your characters are real. They are very real to life. They're complex and they can change in that short space of the story. Dialogue, when used, is meaningful. It reveals character and it moves the story forward. There is no unnecessary dialogue. Setting, where and when the story happens. These details help illuminate the story. Sometimes the setting can act almost as a character in and of itself. Point of view, tone, and style. Who's telling the story? What attitude do they have? The writing approach in a piece of flash fiction is very important, how you choose to approach the story. Now, let's look at an example. Here's an example. The story is The Baby by Donald Barthelme. It is in your textbook. Go read this story in your text. It's one of the three examples in the fiction readings for this week. In the fourth edition print text, it's pages 105 through 107. So it is part of this week's reading. So go find that, take a minute to read it, and then come back to the video. All right. Now, that's a story, right? What a story. Very striking. You're probably like, what the heck? What did you just make me read? Did I just read a child abuse story? What was that? That was the sear on your eyelids that I was telling you about. Now, you may have loved it, you may have hated it, you may have gotten it right away, you may have not gotten it right away, but let's talk about what's going on in the very small space of that flash fiction piece. If you go beneath the surface, so much is happening in such a small space. I'm going to go over a few of the things that are happening there. Now, this story, though it seems to be showing you a child abuse situation from beginning to end, it's actually an allegory. It's using absurd exaggeration. It's not meant to be literal. In the story, the baby stands in for human resistance to authority. Did you catch that? It's creativity versus control or the futility of rigid systems. The story reads like a cautionary tale about rule making taken to extremes. That's what's going on there. Now, I want to stop there before I go any further because a lot of people will read something like that and they will think, how did he have that idea to pack all of that thematically important stuff in there right from the beginning? How did he do that? Well, he, as most writers don't start with that huge idea like I'm going to write an allegory using absurd exaggeration where a baby stands in for human resistance to authority. That's not probably where Barthélemy was in his head when he started writing the story. He probably started out with, what if? What would happen if, let's say, a baby started tearing pages out of a book and then got punished with a number of hours for every torn page. And then as the story developed it became something else. Um, it's interesting to think about that because I think a lot of non-writers look at a story like this and they think that the writer came to it with the idea that it was going to be an allegory, that it was going to have all these deep meanings. But a lot of the time, writers just come at it to write an interesting or thought-provoking story. And then what comes from it arises after the story has been written. So let's look at a few more of the things that are happening there. We have satire. Barthelme ridicules authoritarian bureaucratic thinking by applying it to parenting. The narrator's logic mimics institutions that punish rather than nurture, right? There's dark humor, or what we call black comedy. The humor comes from treating something shocking, like a baby locked up for days, with a casual, matter-of-fact tone. That's one of those attitudes or those writing approaches that creates a certain effect. Absurdism. We see that at work as well. The punishments escalate beyond reason, showing the breakdown of logic itself. I feel like no matter where you are in history, especially now, maybe especially always, I don't know, but I feel like we can really identify if we know the story is an allegory and we know we're not looking specifically at an actual case of Bartelme writing about specifically child abuse, like literally. We know that's not what this is. We know it's meant to be a metaphor or an allegory. I feel like it can really apply um, anytime in history that you're living, you know? So, on the surface, this is about a baby punished for tearing books. But if we treat it as an allegory, what might the baby or the torn pages or the rigid rules symbolize about the larger aspects of human life or society? This is a huge question in a very small story space. And that's the power of flash fiction. That's why I love it so much. That's why we explore it for 4 weeks together in the class. Now, here's some important closing thoughts, all right? And then I'm going to give you your assignment. You may feel a little overwhelmed after reading that story for a multitude of reasons. And that's okay. Try not to feel overwhelmed because I'm going to pull you back now and I'm going to say, all right, just go write a story. Literary fiction writers don't start with big, important questions about society. They start with an idea for a story and then they write it in literary fiction. They write it in the literary fiction genre. And then what ends up happening sometimes is those big questions come if it's a good story. Okay. Literary fiction values originality, ambiguity, and character over plot. It's more character driven than plot driven. Okay. People driven over events driven is another way to think of that. It focuses on style, voice, and complexity, and it lives in uncertainty and nuance. Reading The Baby by Barthelme might have made you feel a little unsettled. As a result, good stories will ask us or cause us to ask big questions, even though the writer didn't necessarily plant them there for us. Okay. So what I'm saying is, I've said this a couple of times. I want you to hear this. Don't be intimidated by the idea of writing flash fiction and from what you've learned here. Okay. Don't think that you have to come to writing your flash fiction with big societal themes and gripping questions. All you need is a story idea. And that, my friend, can come from anywhere. It can start as a tiny thread that you weave and weave and weave until it becomes something. Every story you write is going to help you improve, experiment with styles, enjoy different genres, and let yourself learn by trying. Okay. Now, you're going to click next below and you're going to move on to this week's writing assignment. We're keeping it really simple this week. I'm going to give you 3 possible first sentences with blanks to fill. You're going to choose one of those sentences and then write a story following that sentence. That sentence has to be the first sentence of your story, and then the rest of this, then you write the rest of the story from there. It has to be 500 to 1,000 words long. We're going to keep it short. It must be a complete standalone piece, and it can't be a fragment or a chapter or a piece of something bigger. Okay? You can't say this is just a start. It has to be a whole story in 500 to 1,000 words. Remember, all you need to do is write the story. Don't worry about theme or message or anything other than just telling a good story using the tools of literary fiction that I've gone over here. Okay? These are your only instructions. You're going to see them posted in writing on the writing assignment page. I'm really looking forward to seeing what you come up with, and I look forward to reading your work.